Welcome, and thank you for joining tonight's quiet historical journey, another strange and steady descent into the forgotten corners of ancient life. You're not here for gladiators or emperors on horseback. You've heard those stories before. Instead, we'll be slipping gently into the oddly overlooked, quietly grotesque world of everyday Roman indulgence, particularly when it crossed the border between appetite and something much more intimate. Tonight's first story invites you to recline just as the Romans did, on one elbow, beside low tables of gilded olives and steaming snails, beside rich men and drunken guests, the air thick with rose oil and roasted meat. Our focus isn't just the food, it's what happened between courses and why some Romans, it seems, couldn't tell the difference between what belonged on a plate and what belonged in a bedroom. Let us begin, quietly, with a misunderstanding, one word that history twisted, and a world that was far more revolting than we were taught in school. If you've heard the word vomitorium, you might imagine a tile-lined room where toga-clad Romans knelt to expel the contents of their stomachs, just to return to their feast and start again. It's a revolting picture and strangely persistent, but it's also wrong, or at least only half true. In its original Latin usage, a vomitorium was an architectural term, a passage in Roman amphitheaters that allowed crowds to spew forth from the stadium quickly. The word was about crowd flow, not digestive flow. But over time, especially during the Renaissance and Victorian eras, this term was reimagined. Travelers, scholars, and prudes alike imagined Roman banquets so indulgent, so decadent, that they must have had rooms set aside just for the sole purpose of vomiting. Oddly enough, that wasn't so far from the truth, if not in architecture, then certainly in behavior. The Roman elite, especially by the 1st century CE, had developed a reputation even among their own contemporaries for excessive feasting and sexual indulgence. For many senators, generals, and nouveau rich freedmen, a dinner party was not simply about food. It was a status symbol, a political performance, and more than occasionally a sensual playground. The philosopher Seneca, writing during the reign of Nero, loathed these spectacles. He described guests who vomit so that they may eat, and eat so that they may vomit. Seneca, a Stoic, found such behavior not just distasteful, but morally corrosive. But his disgust gives us a clue. Though there may not have been an official vomiting room, induced vomiting through feathers, potions, or fingers down the throat was a real practice among Rome's elite. And why? Simply put, they wanted to keep going. When the feast began, diners would recline on couches in triclinium rooms, sometimes surrounded by artwork of gods in various sexual acts hardly subtle. Servers brought out dozens of courses, starting with mild fruits and eggs, progressing through fish, roasted game, sauces of fermented fish guts, peacocks stuffed with songbirds, and desserts made of honeyed dates and poppy seeds. It wasn't just abundance, it was escalation. The point was not nourishment, it was overstimulation. Once full, some guests would excuse themselves discreetly, perhaps not to a special vomitorium, but certainly to a servant with a bowl or a quiet corner. Whether they returned to their place or were replaced by someone else, someone younger, or with different intentions, depended on the host. It's here the story turns. In many elite Roman homes, banquets blurred into brothels. The line between guest and entertainment was often faint. Slaves, male and female, were assigned not just to serve food or pour wine, but to stimulate conversation, or more. A wealthy host might provide dancers, musicians, or prostitutes. These were not the subtle entertainments of later salons. Guests sometimes engaged in sexual activity in the same room as the feast, their bodies partly obscured by gauze curtains, or left completely visible. The Roman word convivium, their term for a feast, literally means living together. And yet, in these particular events, the living together was disturbingly transactional. A guest might offer his wife to another as a gesture of generosity, or a host might instruct a slave to accommodate a powerful senator in exchange for political favors later. Roman sources like Petronius and Juvenal hint, sometimes mockingly, sometimes with genuine alarm, at how normalized this sexual sharing had become in elite circles. The most famous literary source for these orgiastic feasts comes from the Satyricon. a satirical novel by Petronius, a courtier of Emperor Nero. The central figure, Trimalchio, is a freed slave turned absurdly wealthy host. His dinner parties include food shaped like the zodiac, piglets stitched with sausages, and servants trained to pretend to cry when they drop a dish. But beneath the comedy is something darker. Guests insult each other, laugh too loudly, and grope one another between gulps of honeyed wine. The excess is clearly meant to reflect Nero's own court and its moral decay. But satire often comes from truth. Historical records, including imperial biographies, Senate writings, and personal letters, describe real feasts where Nero, Caligula, and even Domitian arranged elaborate dinners that doubled as sexual performances. Nero famously hosted wedding ceremonies where he took young boys or eunuchs as spouses publicly, and amid lavish meals, guests were expected to smile, applaud, and then return to eating stuffed thrushes or sea urchins glazed in wine. Why, you might ask, did food and sex become so tightly intertwined for Rome's upper class? Part of the answer lies in the Roman concept of control. A successful Roman man, especially one in politics or military life, was expected to dominate not only others, but also pleasure. Feasting to excess, engaging in public sex, or owning a house full of willing slaves all reinforced that you were a man in power. To abstain was to risk being seen as weak. And so, vomiting wasn't just about emptying the stomach. It was about proving you could handle more than nature intended. In that sense, excess itself became erotic. The bigger the meal, the messier the feast, the more bizarre the act. It all pointed to your freedom. Only someone at the very top of society could afford to waste food and exploit others without consequence. This behavior wasn't universal in Rome, but it was certainly visible, especially among those whose names would later be carved into marble or recorded by disgusted historians. Of course, not everyone in Rome could indulge this way. Most Romans lived modestly, eating bread, porridge, lentils, and seasonal vegetables. For them, even a chicken might be a once-a-month luxury. The idea of vomiting food just to eat more would have been horrifying, perhaps even criminal. And yet, stories of these feasts trickled down, feeding public imagination. Satirical plays mocked gluttons and sexual predators. Poets praised lovers who abstained from excess, and emperors, when trying to restore moral virtue, passed laws limiting how many guests could attend a dinner or how much could be spent. But laws meant little to emperors who broke them themselves. Today, archaeologists have uncovered dining rooms decorated with erotic mosaics, silver utensils shaped like phalluses, and even graffiti that details who did what with whom and where. The vomitorium myth, while technically incorrect in its naming, persists because it reflects a deeper truth that for Rome's most powerful, bodily restraint was a joke. They ate, drank, and touched until the body broke. And when it did, they simply called in another body to replace it. So as you lie back now, picturing a candlelit feast by a courtyard pool, surrounded by incense, moaning lyres, and glistening figs, ask yourself quietly, were these men indulging in life or trying to escape from it entirely? Was their excess a celebration or a symptom? By the time a Roman feast reached its third hour, the air grew thick not just with the scent of meat and wine, but with heat, sweat, and expectation. The guests had loosened their togas, the torches flickered lower, casting the room in amber shadows, and often, this is where things changed. The music slowed. The servants reappeared not with food this time, but with offerings of a different kind. A Roman banquet didn't end with dessert. For the upper class, it ended with entertainment, and often, that meant bodies, young, smooth-skinned, and trained to obey. Some were dancers, others musicians, but more than a few were there for what the Romans politely called recreation, or what the modern world might call state-sanctioned prostitution. It's important to understand that in Roman society, slavery wasn't just legal, it was infrastructure. Nearly 1/3 of the population of Rome were enslaved, and among them, a large portion were used for sexual purposes. The term verni referred to slaves born within the household, often raised from birth to serve specific functions including erotic ones. Owners could use them as they wished, without legal penalty. And many elite households kept entire familiae of sex slaves, men, women, and boys trained in how to please. Some of these slaves were reserved for private use. Others were shown off at banquets as a way of impressing guests, and still others were auctioned off during or after dinner like fine silver or rare birds. There are chilling accounts of feasts where guests were asked to bid on a slave's virginity. As part of the evening's entertainment, one record from the poet Martial even describes a dinner where a young boy is served like dessert, golden-skinned and silent, with oil in his hair and fear in his eyes. Whether the story is metaphor or memory is unclear, but in Rome, those lines often blurred. One of the most documented examples of such depravity is attributed to Emperor Caligula, who ruled from 37 to 41 CE according to historian Suetonius. Caligula turned entire palace rooms into orgiastic banquets where noble women were ordered to strip and perform for senators, and where his own sisters were passed between guests. He famously built floating pleasure barges on Lake Nemi, complete with banquet halls, heated baths, and secret chambers for what were euphemistically called diplomatic negotiations. On these barges, Caligula dined in daylight, surrounded by perfumed waters and velvet cushions. Slaves rowed, servants poured wine into his mouth, and all around, bodies moved, sometimes in rhythm, sometimes in ritual. The banquets were not only indulgent, but symbolic. For Caligula, sex and food were not mere pleasures, they were tools of domination. Just as important as military conquest or senatorial decrees, these displays were designed to shock, but also to bind. If you were a senator who had shared a woman or a boy with the emperor, could you later oppose him in court? Could you betray him, knowing he had seen you drunk and naked? In this way, Roman banquets became political traps. Lust was weaponized, shame was currency, and appetite, whether for oysters or flesh, was a declaration of allegiance. Even emperors known for their austerity found themselves surrounded by such rituals. Domitian, who prided himself on moral reform, allegedly hosted private dinners where slaves were painted entirely black, served only black food, and whispered poetry about death. Guests believed they were attending their own funerals. Whether these stories were true or fabricated by his enemies, they show how deeply Romans associated feasting with spectacle, and spectacle with control. But let's return to the average night, not at the palace, but at the estate of a wealthy senator or retired general. After the last plate was cleared, the guests reclined deeper. The wine was no longer watered down. The music, flutes, lyres, and soft drums slowed to a steady pulse, and the slaves returned, oiled and silent. Some guests chose passive pleasure, a back rub, a whispered poem, a kiss on the toes. Others were more direct. In some houses, orgies were arranged by rank. A guest of high standing could choose first. In others, women free or enslaved might offer themselves willingly, hoping to catch the favor of a patron. For men, offering their wives was not unusual. In fact, it could be a form of social climbing. If a wife impressed a senator, the husband might find himself rewarded with a political appointment or a loan forgiven. This is not to say Roman society was entirely without boundaries. Rape was a crime technically, but the definition was limited. Consent from a slave was not recognized, nor was the dignity of those seen as lower class. For many Romans, the shame of the act depended not on what was done but on who did it, and to whom. One deeply disturbing, but historically verified example comes from the letters of Pliny the Elder, who describes a dinner where a freedwoman refused to perform oral sex on a guest and was punished by being forced to eat from a dog bowl. For the rest of the evening, such humiliations were not uncommon. In the power dynamics of Roman dining, even refusal could be performative, designed to entertain or reinforce hierarchy. Food, too, became a vehicle for perversion. Some dishes were shaped like genitalia, breads baked into phallic shapes, cheeses arranged in suggestive patterns, sauces were used in mock sex acts for entertainment, and body parts of animals were sometimes substituted for human imagery in grotesque jokes. The humor was vulgar, often violent, and rarely challenged. At the center of all this was Roman masculinity, built on dominance. A man was expected to penetrate, never to be penetrated; to feed, never to be fed; to own, never; to serve, the feast. In this way, became a metaphor for the empire. It consumed what it conquered. And that conquered the provinces, the slaves, the women were expected to lay silent on its couch. Yet, not all Romans accepted this without criticism. Satirists like Juvenal and Horace wrote venomously about the hypocrisy of these feasts. They mocked men who praised modesty in public, only to indulge in wine-drenched sodomy and vomiting contests in private. But their critiques rarely reached the people in power. Or if they did, they were welcomed as part of the entertainment. As we imagine these long-ago nights, it's worth noting, not all Roman banquets ended in sex. Some were quiet. Some involved simple meals with conversation about farming or literature. But these weren't the ones immortalized in stone or scrolls. History, like appetite, favors extremes. By the 2nd century, attempts were made to reform Roman morals. Emperors like Marcus Aurelius promoted stoicism and restraint. Laws limited how much could be spent on dinner parties, but loopholes always existed. If a slave cost nothing, how could the law track the transaction? If the act took place behind curtains, could it be considered public? And so, the excess persisted. Beneath the marble and mosaics of Rome, behind the columns and columns of law, was a culture that thrived on appetite without consequence. What lingers in the mind is not just the image of a man vomiting into a gold bowl, but the strange, terrible harmony of the night, the rhythm of the flute, the crunch of roasted chickpeas, the scent of jasmine and urine and wine, and the silence of those who served. Was this the pinnacle of civilization or its quiet collapse? What did the Romans hope to feel when they felt everything at once? By the end of a Roman banquet, 5 or 6 hours in the room rarely looked the way it did at the start. The sweet perfumes of myrrh and rose oil had faded beneath layers of wine, sweat, and bodily fluids. Guests had slipped from witty orators into bloated, glassy-eyed spectators. Music waned, candles guttered low, and all around them, the evidence of excess remained: half-eaten peacock, broken amphorae, silken robes lying in pools of spilled sauce. But perhaps the most enduring residue of these nights wasn't physical at all. It was social, cultural, a slow, creeping rot that few in the moment noticed. What began as indulgence often hardened into expectation, and that expectation of domination, of exploitation, of pleasure above all was baked into the very structure of Roman society. By the late imperial period, Rome's elite feasts had become legends whispered in the halls of villas, dramatized in amphitheaters, and criticized by Stoics, Christians, and even moderate senators. Still, the behavior persisted, in part because it served a purpose beyond mere hedonism. At a certain level of power, feeding others and using others became a form of political theater. To be known as the host of extravagant orgies wasn't necessarily scandalous for many. It was admirable. Guests who dined at such tables were considered fortunate. To serve them was a privilege, at least on paper. This is where the deeper tragedy emerges. Many of those who suffered these humiliations were not seen as victims. They were seen as props in someone else's narrative of power. Consider the life of Julia Drusilla, Caligula's sister, who was said to be both worshipped and objectified at her brother's feasts, while Suetonius writes that Caligula committed incest with her and with his other sisters. Modern historians debate whether the stories are literal or political slander. What matters more is the fact that such stories were believable to the Roman people. This speaks volumes about their expectations of imperial intimacy. The palace had no true private life. Bedrooms, baths, and banquets blurred into one continuous stage, and it was a stage built upon bodies. By the 3rd century, tales of moral collapse among the ruling classes were common even within imperial biographies. The Historia Augusta, for example, accuses Emperor Elagabalus of marrying male lovers, parading his partners through the streets in bridal veils, and arranging nightly banquets that ended in sex rituals honoring foreign gods. Whether every detail is factual is less important than what the stories reveal. A growing belief that Rome's rulers were not only immoral, but unrestrained, and that their appetite would eventually devour the empire from within. This moral anxiety extended beyond the emperors. Even the city's infrastructure began to reflect the erosion of restraint. Brothels increased in number, many of them state-sanctioned. Some were housed above bakeries, others beneath bathhouses. Graffiti from Pompeii shows crude drawings of sex acts alongside menus and price lists. One wall reads, "I had the best time with Felicia. Ask for her after the fish course." But what stands out isn't the existence of prostitution. Nearly every ancient civilization had that. What's unique to Rome is how public it became. Sexuality was scrawled on walls, chiseled into fountains, and hung on necklaces in the form of amulets shaped like erect penises called fascinum. These were worn not just for luck, but to ward off the evil eye. Somehow, the culture had wrapped vulgarity into superstition and pleasure into piety. What we see in this tangled web of beliefs is not mere debauchery, but a civilization struggling to understand its own boundaries. The Roman world prized control, yet its elite lived in ways that defied restraint. They worshipped order yet built homes that celebrated chaos behind closed doors. And perhaps most disturbingly, they viewed the human body as a tool to be trained, decorated, starved, or used, depending on its social position. For the rich, it was something to exhibit. For the poor, something to endure. This idea was reinforced in Roman medical texts, many of which treated sexual health as a matter of class. Wealthy women were prescribed frequent intercourse to balance the womb. Poor women were told to remain abstinent, lest they become a burden. Men, too, were treated differently. A freeborn Roman man could legally assault a slave and still be considered morally upright, so long as the act preserved his dignitas or social standing. Yet even among Romans, there were voices of quiet protest. The philosopher Epictetus, himself born into slavery, taught that the true man was one who mastered desire, not one who satisfied it. He encouraged simplicity, self-discipline, and a view of the body not as a playground, but as a temporary vessel. His students, many from wealthy families, struggled with this view, but the seeds were planted later. Christian writers like Tertullian and Augustine would build on this, denouncing Roman feasts as vile and godless. They preached that abstinence, not indulgence, brought peace. And for those who had been used as objects, women, slaves, and the poor, this new vision offered something rare, a claim to moral worth that did not rely on wealth or beauty. Ironically, it was this moral countercurrent, not a military defeat, that eventually shifted Roman values as Christianity spread through the empire. First as a fringe belief and later as state religion, it slowly choked the excess from public life. Banquets became quieter, brothels went underground, and the vomitoriums, real or imagined, were sealed. But what did Rome lose when it gave up its indulgence? Some argue it gained clarity, structure, and dignity. Others claim it lost its edge, its willingness to explore the edges of experience, to challenge the body, to blur art and appetite. Whatever your view, one fact remains: no empire lasts forever, and no appetite goes unpunished. By the time Rome fell, its rulers were no longer dining on nightingales or parading slaves before drunken guests. The halls were emptier, the streets quieter, the palaces no longer echoed with laughter or moaning. Just wind, dust, and memory. Today, we walk through those ruins and admire their stone. We speak in hushed tones of aqueducts and law codes, but beneath those achievements lies another story, a slower, stickier history of dinners gone too far, of laughter that covered screams, of silk sheets stained with more than wine. And when we ask how such a great civilization fell, we rarely talk about the dinners, the bedrooms, the silence of the servers, the hunger that no empire could ever feed. So now, as you prepare to rest, perhaps on a much simpler bed than those velvet couches of old, consider this. Was Rome's decline carved by swords or by spoons? Was it invaded from without or digested from within? Honey and rot. The unwashed bodies of Rome's upper class will often imagine ancient Rome as a place of marble baths and gleaming aqueducts, of toga-clad elites sipping wine in villas cooled by fountains and shade. And while those images contain a measure of truth, they also hide a more pungent reality, one that clings not to history books, But to bodies, this next story isn't about war, or law, or emperors. It's about smell, about skin, about what was hidden beneath the perfume, and why some of the richest people in the Roman Empire were also some of the filthiest. Tonight, we descend into the world of unwashed power, of men who bathed in oils, but never rinsed, and women who wore cosmetics made from lead and sweat. This is not the glamorous Rome of silver statues, it is the sticky, honey-coated, half-rotting Rome of real life. Let us drift gently into the strange and steamy world of elite Roman hygiene. The scent of status in the modern world, hygiene is often a quiet expectation. A morning shower, a dab of deodorant, a hint of cologne or body spray. Cleanliness is linked to respectability. But in ancient Rome, especially among the upper class, cleanliness did not always mean water. It meant ritual, scent, and surface treatment. To begin, we must understand what bathing meant in ancient Rome. The average Roman citizen bathed regularly in public bathhouses known as thermae. These were vast complexes, often state-funded, that included hot and cold pools, steam rooms, exercise yards, and massage stations. Entry was cheap, sometimes free, and open to nearly everyone except slaves. The bath served not just hygienic purposes but social and political ones, too. But the wealthy, they had different habits. Many aristocrats owned private baths, usually located inside their homes. These were luxurious, but often unused. Why? Because for the elite, the purpose of washing was not necessarily to clean, but to appear refined. And so began the tradition of oiling the body. The typical cleaning process for a Roman nobleman began with the application of olive oil. A slave would rub the oil into the skin, sometimes mixed with crushed herbs or scented resins. Then, using a tool called a stridula, curved bronze or iron scraper, the oil would be scraped off, removing surface dirt and sweat. This was seen as a cleansing ritual. But there was a problem. The stridule didn't reach the pores. It didn't remove bacteria. It simply redistributed the body's oils and layered on fragrance. Over time, this led to the skin becoming coated in a waxy mixture of oil, sweat, dead skin, and whatever fragrances or cosmetics were added afterward. Many Romans believed that bathing in water was unhealthy, especially cold water. Physicians like Galen warned that water opened the pores to corruption. So, elites layered oils on instead. Some men reportedly went weeks without touching water, especially in colder months. Women had their own routines, many of which were even more extreme. To maintain a pale complexion, considered a sign of wealth, aristocratic women used lead-based face creams. These were made from powdered white lead, vinegar, and sometimes donkey's milk. The mixture was applied thickly and refreshed throughout the day. The result was a chalky, ghost-like mask that cracked with expression and smelled faintly of metal and vinegar. To enhance their eyes, women used coal or soot, sometimes mixed with animal fat. For blush, they applied crushed red ochre or mulberry juice. And for lipstick, many used a blend of iron oxide, beeswax, and sometimes the secretions of crushed beetles. When fresh, the effect was dramatic. But under the Mediterranean sun, these substances melted, bled, and sometimes rotted on the skin. And yet, these practices were signs of sophistication. A woman who wore heavy cosmetics was showing that she didn't need to work, didn't labor in the fields, and could afford servants to prepare her creams each morning. The obsession with scent reached nearly every corner of elite Roman life. Wealthy citizens doused themselves in perfumes made from rose, myrrh, cinnamon, and musk. These were not subtle sprays. They were thick oils dabbed onto the chest, neck, and underarms. Some even perfumed their feet or the soles of their sandals. Hair was sprinkled with powdered resin. Beards were combed with ambergris and whale fat. Even clothing was soaked in perfumed water before wearing. One Roman poet, Martial, complained that a man passed me today, and the street still reeks of him. Another, Juvenal, wrote that a woman's kisses tasted like myrrh and bile. But beneath all this fragrance was often a deep, fermented odor, the smell of skin that hadn't truly been cleaned, of garments not washed but reworn with more scent, and of teeth rarely brushed and gums coated in residue from sticky date cakes and goat cheese. The dental habits of the elite deserve their own moment. Toothpaste, as we know it, did not exist. Instead, Romans used tooth powders made from crushed bones, oyster shells, and occasionally charred mouse heads. These were applied with cloth or fingers, not brushes. Breath fresheners included chewing parsley, cloves, or mint leaves, but also rinsing with urine, which was believed to whiten teeth. The ammonia in stale urine did, in fact, have a mild bleaching effect, but the smell and the consequences are easy to imagine. Wealthy Romans also used mouth perfumes, made from wine, honey, and dried herbs, swished and spit between courses. But again, without true brushing, dental rot was common. Some elites replaced missing teeth with ivory or bone implants, fixed with gold wire. These smiles were fashionable, but also uncomfortable and odorous, especially in the heat. Then came the garments. While linen undergarments were sometimes worn, the rich favored woolen togas or silk robes expensive, tightly wrapped, and rarely washed. Wool was difficult to clean and often retained body odors, especially when soaked in perfume. Washing silk was seen as risky, so it was simply hung in the sun, sprinkled with rosewater, and reworn. Some tunics were dyed with colors made from crushed mollusks or fermented urine, which left residual smells even after perfuming. Layer by layer, the body of an elite Roman became less a person and more a mummified display of oil, metal, fabric, scent, and dust. And yet, despite all of this, the poor were considered dirty. Roman elites often described the poor as smelling of fish, garlic, and sweat. But the working class, though far less perfumed, had greater access to true cleansing. They used water freely, bathed communally, and scrubbed with sand or soapwort plants. Their clothing, made of simpler fabrics, could be boiled or rinsed in rivers. They didn't have access to exotic perfumes, but they often smelled more like human beings than their wealthier neighbors. So why did the elite cling to these rotting rituals? Part of it was medical belief. Roman doctors thought that blocking certain smells could prevent disease. Some believed body odor was healthy, others claimed sweat carried impurities out of the body and should not be washed off, only oiled. But more than medicine, it was cultural signaling. To reek of myrrh and honey was to signal class. To wear lead on your face was to show wealth. To refuse cold water was to show that one's body need not labor or adapt. It was decadence disguised as tradition, and over time, it became a kind of rot that seeped not just into clothes, but into the soul of a class convinced it was superior. And so, as we walk past those Roman statues today, perfect marble forms, with calm expressions and idealized bodies, we might wonder, what did those people actually smell like? What did they carry beneath the layers of oil and silk? And was the greatest luxury of all simply being clean? In the high-ceilinged atriums of Rome's elite villas, amid the flickering lamplight and soft rustle of silk garments, a strange transformation unfolded every morning. It was not unlike the preparations for a stage play, and in many ways, it was. 1. Servants arrived before dawn to begin heating the oils, mixing the powders, and grinding the minerals that would turn their masters and mistresses into figures of social perfection, at least by Roman standards. But beneath the powders and perfumes, something more insidious was taking shape. Unknown to them, Rome's aristocracy was slowly poisoning itself layer by luxurious layer. Let us begin with the cosmetics. For elite Roman women, beauty was not only expected, it was required. A pale, unblemished face signaled wealth, laziness, and the promise of good breeding. The paler, the better. But Roman complexions didn't come naturally white. Even the lightest skin would tan under the Mediterranean sun. So to simulate paleness, upper-class women coated their faces in cherusa, highly refined white lead paste. Cherusa was made by suspending thin sheets of lead over vinegar, allowing them to corrode into a chalky white crust. That crust was then ground into powder and blended with animal fat or almond oil. Applied daily, sometimes multiple times a day, it gave the face a ghostly, powder-smooth finish. It also caused chronic lead poisoning. Symptoms ranged from fatigue, stomach cramps, and infertility to seizures and madness, and yet, no one connected the dots. If anything, the visible paleness caused by anemia was admired. Women whose hands trembled were said to possess a delicate nature. Few suspected that the very product meant to preserve beauty was instead destroying their health from the inside. Men, too, were no strangers to dangerous grooming habits. Many applied their own version of face powder, especially if they held positions in court or performed in public. A nobleman with a flushed face or blemished skin risked being seen as weak or drunk. So lead-based foundation or mixtures of chalk and crushed marble were applied liberally. Facial hair was trimmed with bronze razors, which dulled quickly and often tore the skin. Cuts were treated not with antiseptic, but with spider webs, believed to aid healing, a practice not entirely ineffective, as spider silk has mild antifungal properties, but certainly not sterile. For eye enhancement, both men and women used kohl, a dark powder made from galena, another form of lead, soot, and sometimes antimony. Applied with sticks or fingers, it gave the eyes a smoky, exotic look. It also irritated the tear ducts, leading to constant watering, falsely associated with emotional sensitivity. Now we turn to perfumes, perhaps the most intoxicating part of Roman hygiene, and certainly the most persistent. Roman perfumes were complex. They began with a carrier oil, often olive or almond, into which dried flowers, herbs, and resins were steeped for weeks. The most prized essences came from Arabia, India, and Africa: frankincense, cinnamon bark, cardamom, and cassia. Some perfumes included musk derived from the glands of wild animals, or ambergris, a waxy substance secreted by sperm whales. But while the ingredients were exotic, the method was not sterile. Oils were rarely filtered, molds grew easily, and when applied to unwashed skin, the mixture of natural sweat, dust, and heavy scent often produced an overpowering stench, not of rot, but of something more cloying, a smell that lingered for days, clung to garments, and signaled class to those in the know. Some elite Romans layered perfumes deliberately. One nobleman might dab rose oil on his wrists, musk behind the ears, and cinnamon on his sandals. Another might use violet-scented beard balm and mint-scented armpit salve. The result was memorable. Roman writers were divided. While Pliny the Elder admired the artistry of perfume making, Martial once mocked a man whose scent was so strong it could seduce bees. The rituals didn't end with skin. Hair was treated with equal, if not more, obsession. For women, elaborate styles involved braids, pins, extensions, and dyes. Blonde hair was considered the pinnacle of beauty, associated with Germanic captives. So Roman women often bleached their hair using mixtures of wood ash and goat urine. The result was often brittle, patchy, and orange, but socially desirable. Those unwilling to risk bleaching might wear wigs made from imported hair, often gathered from enslaved women in Gaul or Thrace. These wigs were oiled, perfumed, and shaped with heated tongs, the ancient precursor to curling irons. Accidents were common. Burns, scalp infections, and lost hairlines were quietly hidden beneath yet more layers of perfume and decoration. Men, especially aging senators, were equally obsessed. Baldness was considered shameful, so they applied concoctions of vinegar and crushed beetles to their scalps. One popular remedy involved the ashes of burned deer antlers, mixed with honey and rubbed into the skin at night. Did it work? No. But the ritual itself was more important than the result. This obsessive presentation of the body wasn't just vanity, it was a kind of armor. In a society where reputation was everything, one's appearance mattered more than one's health. 2. Admit illness was a weakness. To appear clean, fragrant, and pale even if it was all painted on was a declaration of status. And so, the rich piled on more product, more scent, more illusion. There was no such thing as too much. One ancient satirist joked that you could always tell a nobleman by the trail of rose petals he left behind, like a snail of perfumed oil. Another claimed that aristocratic women had faces made of chalk, sweat, and lies. Yet, curiously, this obsession with artificial hygiene was not extended to living spaces. Many elite Roman homes were lavish in decoration, but filthy in maintenance. Villas lacked plumbing outside the baths. Chamber pots were emptied into street. Gutters, kitchens swarmed with flies, ventilation was poor, mosaics were swept, but corners gathered grime. Bedrooms, especially those used for guests or lovers, were cleaned superficially, then sprayed with incense. There are even accounts of urine jars kept beneath banquet tables used discreetly by diners who didn't want to leave their place in the middle of a long meal. Privacy was rare, cleanliness was relative. What emerges, then, is a strange contradiction. Rome's elite wanted to appear beautiful, clean, and divine, but they achieved this not through washing or health, but through masking, coating, and perfuming. Their bodies became living shrines to artifice, exquisite and toxic, alluring and absurd. Over time, the damage added up: skin ulcers, lead poisoning, lung infections from constant exposure to incense. One Roman physician noted that noble women often died younger than their peasant counterparts. The reason? They wear death as decoration. Still, the rituals continued, because to abandon them would be to descend socially, politically, and even morally. In a world where appearance mattered more than truth, where scent outranked sincerity, and where health bowed before fashion, the path of status led always. As you imagine the quiet moments before a Roman feast, the hours spent anointing and scraping and painting. Consider this: were these people clean, or simply well disguised? And what does it mean to appear pure when the body beneath is quietly dying? By the final years of the Roman Empire, the streets of the capital still glistened with marble, the aqueducts still sang with water, and the villas of the elite still smelled of rose and spikenard. But inside those perfumed walls, something deeper had begun to decay: not just flesh, but the very idea of what it meant to be clean. This last part of the story is not about the rituals or the powders. It's about the consequences. What happened when an entire class of people chose appearance over health, fragrance over function, illusion over truth? The answer, in many ways, is found in their bones. Let's begin with the bodies. Modern archaeology has given us rare insights into elite Roman health. Excavations at sites like Herculaneum, Pompeii, and imperial villas outside Rome have yielded skeletal remains of men and women believed to be upper class, identified by their burial contexts, the wealth of grave goods or inscriptions. The findings are sobering. Many showed signs of lead toxicity known today as plumbism, teeth stained with chemical residue, joint deterioration, craniums with pitting and evidence of neurological degeneration. Several skeletons exhibited deformed jawbones, likely from years of using lead-based facial products or drinking water transported through lead pipes. The Roman diet may have contributed too. The elite often sweetened their wine using sapa, a grape syrup boiled in lead pots. This created lead acetate, a compound now known as sugar of lead. It made the wine smoother, sweeter, and lethally toxic over time. The more refined your wine, the more dangerous it became. The signs of decline were not only physical, they appeared in behavior. Contemporary writers like Galen, Pliny, and later Christian historians describe Roman nobles as weak in body, fragile in appetite, and consumed by invisible illnesses. The stooped gait, trembling hands, and sudden deaths of prominent figures were often attributed to curses or divine punishment. But now we understand that the very rituals of Roman luxury were slowly killing them. Worse, these ailments were dismissed as fashionable. Women who fainted easily were praised for their delicate nature. Men with gray skin were thought to have spent too much time in contemplation. No one suspected the cosmetics, the wine, or the diet. Pain became a symbol of prestige. Meanwhile, the working poor, often mocked for their smells and coarse habits, lived longer and cleaner lives. Their diets: grain, beans, dried fruit, and fresh vegetables were plain but nourishing. They bathed daily in rivers or public baths. Their teeth, while worn, were less likely to decay, as they consumed little sugar and no sapa. Even slaves, though exploited, often had better hygiene due to their duties: washing, scrubbing, handling water. They didn't wear toxic makeup or drink elite wine. They lacked perfume, but they were, paradoxically, more physically resilient. In this, we see a great irony of Rome. The poorest often lived longer simply because they couldn't afford to be poisoned. But even with growing awareness of health, the culture of hygienic theater persisted. As Christianity spread through Rome, it brought with it a new suspicion of the body. Cleanliness became spiritual, not physical. Bathing was discouraged by early monks who saw nakedness as temptation. Some saints reportedly refused to wash for years, wearing lice-infested garments as penance. In rejecting Roman vanity, they swung to the opposite extreme: filth as faith. This rejection of the Roman ideal caused a shift. Perfume fell from favor. Cosmetics were condemned. By the 5th century, Roman-style beauty was no longer admired, it was seen as sinful. And yet, the damage from those earlier centuries: lead poisoning, infertility, skin disease had already marked generations. Let's pause and consider the daily life of a noble woman named Livia. Her name, carved on a burial slab outside Rome. She lived during the reign of Marcus Aurelius and died young. At age 27, her tomb was ornate, her epitaph filled with praise for her grace and devotion. When her remains were examined, researchers found evidence of chronic anemia, dental abscesses, and traces of lead in her bones. Likely, she used Charusa daily. Her ribs bore signs of rickets, perhaps from poor nutrition despite wealth. Her teeth had eroded enamel, likely from wine mixed with vinegar and boiled syrups. Livia probably lived in a villa, wore silk robes, and applied perfume every morning. She dined with poets and philosophers, but beneath the glittering exterior was a woman in slow decline, her body fragile, her breath scented but short. Hers is not a unique story. It is the fate of many whose lives were governed by appearance, and whose world defined beauty as compliance with harmful ritual. The cultural expectations were relentless. To be elite meant maintaining the illusion. Even in illness, one was expected to attend banquets, to appear powdered and coiffed, to host and be hosted. Women nearing death might be propped upright and dressed as if for a wedding. Men would dictate their wills in perfumed chambers, attended by slaves with incense bowls, gasping beneath the weight of wigs and expectation. There are reports of nobles refusing water in their final days, demanding instead to be anointed with scented oils, so the gods would smell them first. In this, hygiene became theater until the very end. And what of the physicians? Roman doctors, many of them Greek slaves or freedmen, knew some of the dangers, but were ignored. Galen warned about lead. Others advised moderation in perfume and simpler diets, but their voices were drowned out by fashion, wealth, and habit. Even emperors disregarded medical advice. Nero reportedly laughed at warnings about his perfume consumption, saying, "Better to die fragrant than forgotten." For many, fragrance became legacy. They hoped to be remembered by how they looked and smelled, not how they lived. Today, we remember Rome's glory, its engineering, its legions, its law. But the story of hygiene is less grand, more intimate, and strangely revealing. It tells us who Rome's people really were when the marble facades were stripped away: human beings, vulnerable and vain, eager to appear divine, even as their bodies crumbled beneath the illusion. And perhaps this is the quiet lesson of their decline, not in battles lost or emperors murdered, but in the slow death of those who mistook appearance for virtue. As you drift now into sleep, picture the villa windows shut tight for the night, the braziers dying down, the scent of jasmine and myrrh still hanging in the air. Somewhere inside, a woman peels the lead from her face. A man scratches beneath his wig. A slave scrapes oil from a master's back and pours it into a bowl for reuse tomorrow. No one speaks. The scent of rot is faint but rising. And so we ask, was the body made to be worshipped or simply washed? The phallic wind chimes of POMPII, sacred symbols or public perversions, lies another truth. Pompeii was once alive with noise, scent, color, and something else entirely: phalluses. Everywhere. They weren't hidden. They weren't private. They hung from doorways, dangled above bakery ovens, glinted from street corners. They were sculpted, painted, and carved into walls. The phallus in Pompeii wasn't a symbol of obscenity, it was a symbol of protection, prosperity, and sometimes playful vulgarity. But to the modern eye, it can feel like a city obsessed. This story isn't just about one city, it's about a broader Roman custom, one that blurs the line between sacred and salacious. So let's walk, slowly and quietly, through those stone streets and past those strange decorations, and ask what it all meant. If you were to stroll through Pompeii in the 1st century CE before Vesuvius erupted, you wouldn't need to look far to find a phallus. It might be carved into a paving stone beneath your feet. It could be etched onto a doorway as a charm. It might hang from a wind chime, complete with wings and bells. Some were erect, some winged, some exaggerated, some smiling, some grotesque. To a modern traveler, it might seem shocking, but to a Roman, it was no more obscene than a horseshoe above a door or a lucky coin in a pocket. These phalluses were part of daily life. They weren't just tolerated, they were celebrated. In Roman culture, the phallus called fascinum was a powerful protective symbol. Its roots lay deep in ancient superstitions. Long before the Republic or the Empire, Romans believed that envy, known as the evil eye, could harm children, crops, or fortunes. The best way to ward it off? Display something so shocking, so bold, that it would deflect the jealous gaze. And what better than the phallus, brash, shameless, and symbolic of both life and fertility? So the fascinum was used everywhere. Soldiers carried tiny bronze phalluses on chains around their necks. Children were given amulets in the shape of male genitals. Women sometimes wore them under their tunics for protection during childbirth. Even generals and emperors had phallic charms embroidered discreetly into their clothing or armor. Pompeii, in particular, offers the most concentrated glimpse of this practice. Why Pompeii? Partly because of its preservation. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE trapped the city in volcanic ash, freezing its contents in time. Frescoes, graffiti, even wooden wind chimes were sealed from decay. Among the most curious discoveries were phallic tintinnabuli, small bronze or clay wind chimes, shaped like winged phalluses, often with legs or animal heads, hung in doorways and gardens. These weren't erotic novelties. They were spiritual tools. When the wind blew, the bells chimed. The sound was thought to repel curses, much like bells in other cultures. The wings symbolized movement, action, virility in flight. Some even had faces grinning grotesquely, meant to startle wandering spirits. These devices served two purposes: to amuse and to protect. And in a city like Pompeii, built on superstition, volcanic soil, and frequent tremors, protection was a daily concern. But not all phallic images were purely apotropaic protective. Some were directional. Walk the streets of Pompeii, and you'll find phalluses carved into walls and stones pointing a certain direction toward brothels. Scholars once believed these were road signs, crude arrows meant to guide travelers toward pleasure houses. Others now argue they were jokes, graffiti left by mischievous boys, or even misinterpreted decorative flourishes. The Lupanar, Pompeii's most famous brothel, had no lack of phallic imagery painted above doorways, carved into beds, sketched beside erotic murals. But phalluses appear elsewhere, too, on bakeries, taverns, and family homes. Clearly, they weren't confined to the sex trade. They belonged to everyone. Inside many homes, the phallus made another appearance in the kitchen. Roman kitchens often had small household shrines called lararia, dedicated to the lares, protective domestic spirits. These shrines sometimes included miniature phallic statues, nestled between depictions of family gods and offerings of bread or wine. The message was clear: fertility, food, and fortune were linked. In fact, one famous fresco from the House of the Veti, belonging to a pair of wealthy freedmen, shows Priapus, the god of fertility, weighing his enormous phallus against a bag of gold. It's absurd, comical, and deeply Roman. The implication: prosperity and virility are one and the same. To laugh at Priapus is to laugh at fate and, perhaps, to humble yourself before it. Even Roman temples embraced the symbol. The god Mercury, patron of commerce and travelers, was sometimes shown with a phallic staff. Priapus himself, though a minor deity, had shrines throughout rural Italy. Farmers prayed to him for fertile fields. Gardeners erected statues of him, often with warning inscriptions declaring that thieves would be punished by his watchful member. The blending of the sacred and the sexual was typical in Roman life. Sex wasn't inherently sinful. It was natural, divine, and occasionally hilarious. Of course, not all Romans viewed these displays with comfort. The poet Juvenal writing in the early 2nd century CE, sneered at the vulgarity of everyday Rome. He accused the city of being obsessed with groin and gold. Meanwhile, early Christian writers condemned such symbols as pagan filth. As Christianity gained influence, many of these images were destroyed, buried, or reinterpreted. But in Pompeii, sealed beneath ash, they survived. And because they survived, we now see just how deeply embedded the phallus was in Roman identity. It wasn't just a joke or a marker of vice. It was an everyday tool, a language of protection, fertility, humor, and belief. So, as we walk those ash-coated streets in our minds, past the bakeries and atriums and doorways where these wind chimes once twirled in the breeze, we're left with a question. Was ancient Rome obsessed with sex, or simply unashamed of life? As morning light rose over the tiled rooftops of Pompeii, the city would awaken not only to the soft bleating of goats or the scrape of sandals on stone, but also to a peculiar sound, the faint clinking of tiny bells. In the breeze, the tintinnabula, bronze wind chimes shaped like winged penises, swayed gently above doorframes. Their sound was said to chase away evil spirits and invite good luck. But what they represented, what they truly meant, was far more complex than a simple superstition. In this section of the story, we step deeper into the strange, half-laughing, half-reverent world of Priapus, Rome's most indecent god, and what he tells us about ancient ideas of masculinity, power, and protection. Priapus wasn't just a symbol, he was a presence. Born of Aphrodite and Dionysus in some myths, Priapus was cursed at birth by Hera, jealous of his mother's beauty. The curse, permanent arousal and grotesque ugliness. Cast out of Olympus, he became a protector of gardens, fields, and livestock. Why such an obscene god for such humble duties? The answer lies in his power, fertility. In the Roman imagination, Priapus stood at the threshold between order and chaos. On one hand, he brought growth crops, babies, wealth. On the other, he threatened thieves, intruders, and even laziness. His statues were erected at entrances to gardens, granaries, even homes, often carved from wood and painted red. He stood, with exaggerated features, holding his swollen phallus like a club. Sometimes, a threatening inscription accompanied him. "I will strike you with this if you steal." Pompeii had dozens of Priapus statues. The most famous resides in the house of the Veti, one of the grandest homes in the city. In a small vestibule, just past the entry, Priapus is depicted weighing his enormous phallus on one side of a scale, with a bag of coins on the other. The joke is clear: fertility is as valuable as gold or more. But the message isn't just humor, it's status signaling. The owners of the house, wealthy freedmen, were reminding guests, "We have arrived, we are prosperous, we are protected." It's worth noting that these images weren't hidden in private bedrooms. They were placed in public areas where visitors, clients, and even children would see them. This openness reflects a society in which symbols of sex weren't shameful, they were strategic. To understand this fully, we must separate modern assumptions from ancient ones. In our world, explicit imagery is often restricted, taboo, or linked with secrecy. But to a Roman, nudity and sexual imagery were woven into daily life. The difference wasn't in the image, it was in who controlled it. The phallus, when displayed by the powerful, was a sign of authority and good fortune. When found in graffiti or lower-class homes, it could be interpreted as vulgarity. The same image, proud and erect, could be protective charm, obscene joke, or religious tribute, depending entirely on the context. This flexibility gave the phallus incredible cultural power. It was a symbol both earthy and divine, common and elite. Tintinnabula were the most creative of these expressions. Far from being uniform, they took many shapes. Some had animal legs, like roosters or lions. Others bore multiple phalluses, sometimes with wings or tiny human heads. Bells dangled from testicles. Faces grimaced or grinned. One surviving piece shows a chimeric figure with a bearded face, bird wings, a horse's tail, and 6 phalluses, each ending in a bell. Another includes a small key, suggesting it may have functioned as both protection and wardrobe charm, meant to jingle as its owner walked. We might laugh now, but these charms were taken seriously. In a city like Pompeii, where earthquakes were frequent and death was always near. A person's first line of defense might be a wind chime shaped like a flying phallus. This isn't to say all Romans saw the symbol with equal comfort. Even in ancient times, some intellectuals mocked or recoiled from such imagery. The Stoics viewed indulgence in sexual symbolism as a distraction from virtue. Christian writers, especially as the faith spread in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, began condemning these symbols as pagan obscenities. Tertullian, a prolific Christian author, described Priapus as a wooden shame, worshipped by fools. Clement of Alexandria warned parents against exposing children to such sights. As Christian morality expanded its influence, statues of Priapus were quietly removed or buried. The phallic freedom of public life began to disappear. And yet, even as public displays declined, private use of the fascinum continued. Small charms survived in homes. Protective amulets passed from parent to child. The fear of the evil eye remained strong enough to preserve ancient superstition, even after its public celebration was outlawed. Let us pause at this curious intersection. Pompeii, at the moment of its destruction in 79 CE, stood at a crossroads, a city still fully embedded in old Roman ritual, just beginning to feel the whispers of coming change. Its walls bore erotic paintings, phallic graffiti, and sacred inscriptions, all untouched by shame. Then came the Ashdod, and so, unlike other Roman cities that evolved gradually toward Christian norms, Pompeii was preserved in its rawest state, a time capsule of phallic belief and ritual display. In this sense, Pompeii shows us what the Roman world looked like before modesty became mandatory, before the bedroom replaced the atrium as the place for sexual imagery, before symbols of fertility became sins. But we should be cautious in our interpretation. While the images are explicit, the intent wasn't always erotic. For many Romans, especially the working class, a fascinum wasn't a joke, it was a lifeline. Something to keep the gods watching, to keep disease away, to protect a baby, a crop, a marriage. The phallus, in Roman life, was never just a symbol of sex. It was a symbol of life's power, unpredictability, and vulnerability. By hanging it in the wind, Romans weren't flaunting filth, they were begging for mercy from a world they didn't understand. So now, imagine standing in a stone courtyard beneath the bright Campanian sun, hearing the soft clang of bronze bells in the wind. A dog sleeps in the doorway, a baker's boy runs past. No one laughs at the chime, it is part of the house, as natural as bread, water, or air. And in that quiet, ask yourself, was this symbol vulgar or simply honest? When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, it silenced everything. The footsteps, the laughter, the whispered prayers, the wind chimes. The final moments of Pompeii and of neighboring Herculaneum were not slow. Within hours, pyroclastic surges roared through homes, brothels, bakeries, and courtyards, preserving them not in life, but in the posture of interruption. Plates mid-meal, lamps still lit, bodies curled in futile shelter. And scattered among them, in surprising numbers, were the symbols of life that had once been believed to ward off death. Phalluses winged, carved, gilded, baked into walls remained where they had always been, untouched, yet silenced, their jingles now entombed in ash. And perhaps that is where this strange chapter of Roman life reaches its most poetic ending. For these symbols, so obsessed with virility, vitality, and the power of being seen, would now spend centuries unseen, buried beneath the very earth they were meant to defend against. The rediscovery of Pompeii in the 18th century was not entirely celebratory. When the first phallic images emerged from the ruins, the European archaeologists, many of them working under monarchies, or the Catholic Church, were scandalized. Frescoes of Priapus were hastily covered or removed. Erotic murals were taken down. The famous statue from the House of the Veti was hidden in a cabinet and labeled dangerous. Thus began the creation of the Gabinetto Segreto, the secret cabinet, of the Naples National Archaeological Museum. Here, behind locked doors, the sexually explicit artifacts from Pompeii were kept. Sometimes for centuries, access was limited to male scholars and dignitaries. Women were denied entry unless accompanied by a man. Even in modern times, access to the collection was limited until the early 2000s, what the Romans displayed openly. Later societies buried twice, once by nature, then again by shame. But what was so dangerous about a flying bronze penis? Perhaps it wasn't the object itself, but what it represented. The Roman world, for all its brutality, had allowed space for something modern society often struggles to hold: the coexistence of the sacred and the vulgar, the ridiculous and the revered. The wind chimes of Pompeii were protection, comedy, art, and religion all at once. That ambiguity made them hard to categorize, and anything that can't be neatly categorized tends to make people uncomfortable. What's remarkable, though, is how many of these artifacts existed. Excavations have uncovered hundreds of tintinnabula, fascinum amulets, and phallic frescoes throughout Pompeii, Herculaneum, and the broader Roman Empire. From military outposts in Britain to villas in Gaul, the symbol traveled small enough to carry, potent enough to display. In the barracks of Vindolanda, a Roman fort near Hadrian's Wall in Britain, a graffiti sketch of a phallus was found, scratched into a wooden wall plank, alongside the words Secundus the Lucky. Even on the empire's edge, thousands of miles from Italy, the symbol persisted. The question is, did these men believe it worked? Did they sleep better under it? Watch. The rituals around the phallus were rarely explained in writing. They were taught by living, passed from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, soldier to soldier. A child might be given a fascinum pendant without ever being told why. A baker might hang a chime simply because his father had done so. Belief does not always require clarity. For many Romans, these symbols were like insurance just in case. They needed no theology, no priest, no altar. They were domestic, daily, intimate. And when disaster finally came, not by curse, but by nature, they remained in place, as silent witnesses. So what do we do now? Standing centuries later, peering into vitrines in quiet museums, trying to understand these winged objects. Do we laugh? Some do, others wince. But perhaps the better question is, what were they trying to say? Not just "this protects me," but perhaps something deeper. I am vulnerable. I want to live. I hope this works. The phallus, in this way, becomes not a joke or a brag, but a confession, a symbol of the body, its fertility, its fragility, its absurdity. In a world without antibiotics or guarantees, sometimes a bell and a bronze charm were all you had. And so, as you close your eyes and drift gently into sleep, picture this: a quiet Roman home in late summer. The scent of bread, the hum of bees, a garden wall shaded with vines, and above the doorframe, a small bronze chime, gently rocking in the wind. It is obscene. It is ridiculous. It is beloved. It is all that stands between this home and the unknown. And when the ash comes, it stays. So we ask, were the Romans obsessed with desire, or simply more honest about its power? And if something silly is also sacred, must we choose only one?